The hall was built to make people feel small. That was what Cole Dawson thought when he first walked into it. Ceilings went up so high that the top was lost in shadow. The walls were covered in carvings that told the history of the Velhari Empire in images. Going back 900 years, the floor was polished black stone that reflected everything like still water. 14 delegations from 14 different worlds stood in groups around the hall, all of them dressed in their finest, all of them speaking in low, careful voices. Cole was not dressed in his finest. He was dressed in his uniform. It was pressed and correct, and that was all he asked of it. He stood near the table of the human delegation and let his eyes move slowly around the room the way they always did. Checking corners, checking exits, checking faces. It was not something he thought about anymore. It was just the way his eyes worked. After 23 years, he was the security detail for Ambassador Patricia Odom. That was his entire job here. He was not a diplomat. He had no opinions about trade agreements or territorial boundaries or the 17 items on the summit agenda. He was here to stand near Patricia and make sure nothing bad happened to her. He was very good at this. He had been very good at it for a long time. Patricia was already deep in conversation with a delegate from the Morvian system, her voice smooth and confident, her hands moving in, and the careful gestures she used when she wanted to seem open and friendly. Cole watched the room and stayed quiet. He had slept for 4 hours. In the last 30, the Fold space transit had been long and rough, and the food on the ship had been worse than usual. His feet hurt. None of this showed on his face. He was 41 years old. His hair had gone gray at the sides. His hands were large and rough from years of work that was hard on hands. There was a scar running from his left ear down to his jaw, thick and pale, the kind of scar that told its own story to anyone who knew how to read it. He was not a large man, not particularly tall, but there was something about the way he stood that took up space anyway, still watchful, like something that had learned long ago that patience was more useful than speed. The Eastern Arch opened and the room changed, not loudly. There was no announcement, no trumpet, no signal, but every person. The hall shifted the way tall grass shifts when wind moves through it, and Cole's eyes went to the arch. Automatically, the princess of the Velhari Empire walked in. Her name was Thessaly Veron. She was young by the measure of her people, which meant she had lived through about 60 standard years, though she looked far younger than that. Her skin was pale violet, smooth and luminous under the blue lighting of the hall. She had 4 fingers on each hand, long and thin, and she moved with a slow ease that came from never once having been told to hurry. Her dark hair was threaded through with silver wire that had been shaped into something like a constellation. She wore robes of deep blue and silver that moved differently than cloth should move, as though they had a small life of their own. She was the daughter of Emperor Veron III. She had been told from birth that she was important. She had believed it completely and without question, and there was no reason she should have done otherwise, because everything she had ever encountered had confirmed it. She walked through the hall the way water moves downhill, naturally, without effort, expecting everything to get out of the way. Her gaze moved around the room, touching each delegation briefly, assessing, categorizing. It was a Practiced look, the look of someone who had been trained to understand political value. At a glance it landed on Cole. She stopped walking. She looked at him. The way someone looks at something that does not belong where it is. Then she turned to the attendant at her left shoulder, a thin, pale man whose job was to know things, and she spoke in the common trait tongue that every delegate in the hall could understand. Why has the human delegation brought a laborer to a diplomatic summit? The attendant said nothing. He had learned that silence was almost always the correct response. A few delegates nearby went very still. Patricia stopped talking mid-sentence. The Moravian delegate she had been speaking with found something interesting to look at. On the other side of the room, Cole did not move. His expression did not change. His eyes stayed on the princess. Thessaly walked closer. She studied his hands, his scar, the worn quality of his posture, the way someone who had spent too long in difficult places carries themselves differently from someone who has not. She looked at all of this and she saw what she had decided to see. His hands are the hands of someone who does physical work. She said she was not speaking to Cole, she was speaking to the room, making an observation the way person might comment on the weather. His face has clearly been damaged at some point. He looks like a man who digs roads. She paused, a faint smile on her lips. Is this a statement of some kind? Do humans send working-class people to diplomatic events to demonstrate humility? It seems like a strange choice. A delegate from the Drovian system standing near the far window made a small sound. It was not quite a laugh. It was the sound a person makes when they find something amusing but are not sure yet if they are allowed to show it. Patricia opened her mouth. Cole touched her arm. One touch, light, brief. She closed her mouth. He looked at the princess. His voice came out the same way it always came out, flat and even and unhurried. Sergeant First Class Cole Dawson, he said, security detail for Ambassador Odom. Were you injured on the job? Yes, ma'am. Construction work, something industrial combat. Ma'am. She made a small sound, not quite dismissive, not quite amused. Somewhere between the two. Frontier conflict. I suppose humans are always fighting each other over small pieces of land. It must keep you very busy. She turned away from him. She was already done with this. Tell your delegation that this is the Saros Summit. 14 systems are represented here. Presentation matters. She looked at Patricia directly for the first time. Bring someone appropriate next time. She moved toward the central dais, and the hall slowly filled back up with sound. Voices resuming, conversations restarting, everyone pretending they had not just watched what they had watched. Patricia turned to Cole very slowly. Her voice was low. Are you all right? Yes, ma'am, he said. She looked at his face and found nothing there to read. She had absolutely no idea. No, he said she did not. He went back to watching the room. His eyes moved to the exits, to the corners, to the faces. Patricia watched him for a moment longer, then turned back to her work. Across the hall near the Eastern Arch, Commander Yella Soys of the Velhari Imperial Guard had watched the entire thing from beginning to end. She had not made a sound. She had not moved, but her eyes had not left Cole Dawson since the moment the princess had opened her mouth. And when the princess was settled at the dais and the hall had returned to its careful noise, Yella turned and walked quietly back to her office. She had a personnel File to pull, she had a feeling it was going to be a very interesting read. He destroyed empires. Yellow sovereigns had a small office near the rear of the vessel, away from the grand halls and reception rooms, away from the places where important people walked slowly and looked important. Her office had one desk, one chair, a narrow window that showed stars, and a terminal that was connected to every intelligence network the Velhari Empire had access to. It also through agreements she had spent 5 years quietly building had access to the interspecies shared military database that covered most of the known settled systems. She sat down, pulled up the human delegation files, and started reading. Ambassador Patricia Odom, first 12 years of diplomatic service, 7 languages, 3 major treaties, a clean record with no serious complaints, and several strong commendations. Yella noted all of this and moved on. Then she opened the file for Sergeant First Class Cole Dawson. She read it through once quickly, the way she read everything the first time. Then she went back to the beginning and read it again slowly. Then she sat in her chair and looked at the wall for a while. Cole Dawson had joined the Earth Confederacy military at 18 years old, a year when humanity was still fighting for basic recognition in the wider galactic community. He had deployed for the first time 8 months after enlisting. The deployment was to a place called the Harran Belt, where a territorial dispute between 2 minor factions had spilled over into civilian shipping lanes, and someone needed to go make it stop. His unit had made it stop. That was the beginning. The file went on for a long time after that. There were 11 deployments over 23 years, not short ones, not the kind where a soldier ships out for a few months and comes home again. Long ones, complicated ones, the kind that appeared in military history records with names like the Harran Intervention and the Port Vellum Standoff and the Reach 7 Crisis. Each one of those names meant something to anyone who paid attention to how conflict moved through the settled systems. Each one of them had been, at the time it happened, genuinely dangerous, the kind of dangerous where the outcome was not certain and the cost was going to be high no matter what. Cole had been at all of them. He had 2 distinguished service crosses, which was already unusual. Most soldiers who received one never received a second, because the circumstances that earned a Distinguished Service Cross were the kind of circumstances that most soldiers sensibly tried very hard not to be in. Twice, he had the Star of Valor, which the Earth Confederacy gave to living soldiers for action that had changed the outcome of a conflict in a meaningful way. Very few of those existed. Yella had to check the number. There were 31 Stars of Valor in the entire history of the Earth Confederacy military. Cole Dawson had one of them. And then there was the Caravan Campaign. Yella knew the name. She had known it for years. Every serious military analyst in the settled systems knew the Caravan Campaign, even the ones who had not been involved, even the ones whose species had no direct stake in it, because it was the kind of event that changed how people thought about things. 4 years ago, the Drossian Collective had moved against 4 neighboring systems simultaneously. It was a coordinated action, well planned, and the coordination was the point. Each individual attack was manageable. All 4 at once was not. 3 allied species had assessed the situation and surrendered their positions within the first week. The Math was not in their favor, and they were not wrong to make the choice they made. The humans had been asked to hold one corridor, just one, the caravan station corridor, which connected two of the four systems, hold it long enough for civilian ships to get out. That was the ask, maybe 48 hours, maybe less. It was not expected to hold longer than that. The Dracian armored column moving toward caravan station had 400 soldiers and heavy equipment and a command structure that had not lost a campaign in 6 years. Cole's unit had 30 soldiers and standard infantry gear, and Cole, they had held the corridor. They had done more than hold it. The details were in the file, and Yella read them carefully. The Dracian column had moved into the corridor, expecting a delaying action, expecting to push through in a few hours with acceptable losses. What they had found instead was a corridor that had been completely rethought. Every junction point turned into a choke point, every side passage sealed or trapped. The column could not move fast because every step cost them something. They burned time trying to figure out what was happening to them, and while their burned time, the civilian ships got out, and then more time passed, and the column started losing its shape. Then Cole had collapsed the forward section of the station on top of the Dracian command unit. He had placed the charges himself in a pressurized cargo section while the column was still inside it. The remote trigger had malfunctioned. He had detonated it manually and then walked out of a section of station that was folding in on itself with 2 broken ribs and a wound on his jaw that would later need 60 stitches to close. 18 of the 30 soldiers had made it out. The Dracian collective had pulled back from all 4 systems within the week, not because they had been destroyed. They still had the numbers, still had the equipment. They pulled back because their entire command structure for the campaign was gone, and because something about what had happened at Caravan Station had introduced a calculation they had not accounted for. The human forces had not fought like a rear guard. They had fought like people who intended to win. That was a different kind of opponent. The campaign was studied for years after. Military analysts from 6 different species had written about it. The general conclusion was that the outcome at Caravan had prevented a broader conflict that would have pulled in at least 8 systems and lasted years. The civilians who had evacuated through that corridor numbered somewhere above a 100,000. Yella closed the file. She thought about the Grand Hall. She thought about Thessaly standing in front of Cole, Dawson looking at his rough hands and his scarred face and saying the words she had said in front of 14 delegations. She thought about the Drovian delegate who had made that small sound near the window. She thought about Cole's voice, flat and even, saying only what was necessary and nothing more. She stood up from her desk and straightened her uniform. The princess was in her private chambers reviewing trade documents. Yella had interrupted her before for less important reasons. This was without question the most important interruption she had made in 3 years of service. On this vessel, she printed a single page, 1 page only, because she knew the princess, and the princess responded better to things that could be absorbed quickly. 1 page was enough. 1 page in this case was more than enough. She picked it up and walked down the long corridor toward the private chambers, past the silver walls and the carved history of an empire that was very proud of itself. She knocked and went in. Princess looked up from her documents. with the expression she wore when she was being interrupted and wanted the interrupting person to know it. Commander Thessaly said, "I am working." "Your Highness," Yella said, "I need 5 minutes." She set the single printed page on the table in front of the princess. "I need you to read this." Thessaly looked at the page, then she looked at Yella. Something in Yella's face made her pick it up without arguing. The room was quiet for a long time. Outside the narrow window of the private chamber, the stars moved very slowly, the way they always did, patient and indifferent. Inside, the only sound was the soft sound of the princess breathing as she read and then stopped breathing for a moment and then read on. Thessaly Varon put the page down on the table. She did not put it down quickly or carelessly. She set it down slowly, the way a person sets something down when they are not quite ready to stop touching it, but they know they need to stop because holding it any longer will not change what is written on it. She looked at the window. Outside, the stars were still cold, very far away. "Caravan campaign," she said. Her voice was not the same voice she used in the hall. In the hall, her voice was smooth and easy, shaped by years of training. This voice was quieter, a little more uncertain. "That was him." "Yes," Yella said. "He placed the charges himself. The remote trigger failed. He stayed behind to detonate them manually. He was inside the pressurized section when the forward structure began to collapse." Yella kept her voice even. She was not trying to make the princess feel worse than she already did. She was simply reporting. "He walked out with 2 broken ribs and a wound on his face that required 60 stitches." Thessaly was quiet for a moment. "The scar?" "Yes, I thought." She stopped. She did not finish the sentence because finishing it would mean saying out loud what she had thought, and saying it out loud would make it worse. Yella did not fill the silence. She had learned a long time ago that silence was useful. People said more into silence than they said into questions. The D Cyan Collective withdrew from all 4 systems. The said slowly, "I remember when that happened. I was in my 3rd year of political study. My instructor used it as an example of how a smaller force can affect a larger outcome through positioning and timing." She paused. She never mentioned names. Most people who write about it do not mention names. Yella said they discuss the strategy, the numbers, the outcome. They talk about the humans as a unit. They do not tend to write much about the individual who was last out of the collapsing section. She paused. "That is partly because Cole Dawson does not appear to have given many interviews." Thessaly turned from the window and looked at her. "What else does the file say?" 23 years of service, 11 deployments, none of them routine, 2 distinguished service crosses, the Star of Valor, which is the highest recognition the Earth Confederacy gives to a soldier who is still alive. Yella folded her hands in front of her. "Port Velam reached 7, the Heron Belt. Each one of those is a name that appears in Maltese's military records as a significant event. He was present at all of them. In each case, the human forces were understaffed and working against worse odds than anyone had planned for. In each case, they managed. Anyway," she tilted her head, "he managed repeatedly for over 2 decades." Princess stood up from her chair and walked to the window. She stood there, looking out at nothing in particular, her arms folded, her silver hair threading, catching the light. 14 delegations heard what I said," she said. "Yes," the Drovian delegate laughed. "He Made a sound, Yella said carefully. I would not call it a laugh, but it was audible. Thessaly pressed her lips together, and Cole Dawson stood there and said nothing. He gave his name and his rank and nothing else. He did not correct me. No. Why? She turned from the window. Her expression was genuinely curious, the kind of curious that sat next to something heavier. He could have said anything. He had every right to. Yella considered the question seriously, the way it deserved to be considered. I think, she said, after a moment, that he does not feel the need to explain himself to people who have already decided what he is. He has been doing his work for 23 years. He does not. Pause. Thessaly looked at the floor, then she looked back at Yella. What would you have done in his position? It was an unusual question. The princess did not often ask what other people would do. Yella took it as a sign that something real was happening in the conversation. I would have been angry, Yella said honestly. I might not have shown it, but I would have felt it. I'm not sure I would have been as still as he was. He was completely still. Yes. Not performing stillness, Thessaly said slowly, not pretending. Actually still. As though what I said did not reach him. Yella said nothing to this because the princess was working something out, and interrupting would not help. That is worse, Thessaly said quietly, in a way. If he had flinched, if he had looked hurt or angry, it would mean my words had weight to him, but they did not. Because he already knows what he is. He has always known. My opinion of him for 30 seconds meant nothing to him at all. She let out a slow breath. That is a very hard thing to earn. It is. And I looked at him and saw a laborer. Yella did not agree out loud because she did not have to, and because the princess did it not need to hear it again. She had said it herself. The room was quiet for a while. Outside in the corridor, footsteps passed and faded. Somewhere in the wider vessel, the summit was continuing. Delegates were talking. Agreements were being explored. History was being made slowly and carefully in the ordinary way. He saved 100,000 people in that corridor, Thessaly said. The estimates vary. That is the low end. With 30 soldiers and a plan that should not have worked, it worked because he understood the space better than the enemy did, and because he was willing to be the last person out. Yella said, those are not complicated qualities. They are simply very rare. Thessaly picked up the page from the table again. She looked at it for a moment, then set it back down. She straightened her robes. Something in her posture had changed in the past few minutes, though it was a subtle thing. The kind of change that comes from inside rather than outside. I want to speak to him, she said at the reception this evening. Yes, she paused. I am going to apologize to him. Yella looked at her for a moment. The princess was 23 years old by human counting, though time moved differently for her species. She was young. She had been raised to believe that her opinion of a person was worth something simply because it was her opinion. That belief was being adjusted right now in real time, and she was not fighting it. That was not nothing. That was actually quite a lot. He will not make it difficult for you, Yella said. Thessaly looked at her. How do you know that? Because nothing in that file suggests a man who would, she said simply. He has been in harder situations than an apology. He will handle it with the same stillness he handles everything else. The princess was quiet for a moment, then she nodded. Once a small decisive nod and walked back to her table and sat down. "Thank you, Commander," she said. "You can go." Yella turned to leave. She was almost at the door when the princess spoke again. "Yella," she stopped. "Your Highness." There was a pause. "I am glad you told me." Yella opened the door. "I thought you would be," she said. The second evening reception began at the 7th bell, which was how the Vilhari marked time, and which meant nothing to Cole except that the room filled up again and he went back to standing near the wall. Lighting was softer tonight. Someone had adjusted it. Or perhaps it was just the time of day in the vessel's cycle. The food tables had different things on them, strange shapes and stranger smells, and the delegates moved between them with the careful social choreography of people who were pretending to be more comfortable than they were. Patricia was near the center of the room talking to two people at once, which she was very good at. Cole watched the room and stayed near the edge of it. He was not thinking about yesterday. That was not quite accurate, but it was close enough. He had thought about it once last night in the way he thought about things that were done and could not be undone, which was to look at it clearly and then put it away. The princess had made an assumption. The assumption was wrong. She had said the wrong assumption out loud in front of people because she was young and used to saying whatever she thought without much cost. None of that was new. Cole had encountered all of those things before, in different shapes, and he had never found them particularly useful to dwell on. What he was thinking about in the quiet background way he thought about things during long-standing shifts was the room itself, the exits, the way the crowd moved. There was a Catherine delegate near the food table who had been watching the human delegation more than he watched anything else, which was probably nothing, probably just curiosity, but Cole had noted it. There was a corridor entrance behind the eastern tapestry that the floor plan had not mentioned, which he had found on his own walkthrough that morning. Small things, the small things were the job. He noticed the princess coming toward him with about 10 seconds to spare. She was not walking the way she had walked yesterday. Yesterday she had moved through the room like she owned it, and she did own it technically, but there had been something unconscious in it, something that did not consider the possibility of any other relationship between herself and the space around her. Tonight she was walking with intention. She had decided to walk toward him, and she was doing it, and the deciding was visible in a small way, in a slightly more deliberate placement of her steps. He registered all of this. Without expression, she stopped in front of him. She was taller than him by a few inches. Her amber eyes met his directly, which was a choice, not a habit. "Sergeant Dawson," she said. "Your Highness." She did not do anything with her hands. She did not look away. She had Cole thought prepared for this conversation, in the way careful people prepare for things they find difficult. "I spoke to you poorly yesterday," she said. "I looked at you, and I decided what you were before you had said a single word, and then I said what I had decided out loud in a room full of people." She paused. "I have since learned how wrong I was, but I want you to understand that the apology is not because of what I learned. The behavior was wrong before I knew anything about your record. I should not have spoken about a person that way, regardless of who they were or what they had done. It was a careful apology, an honest one." Cole could tell the difference between an apology that was offered to repair someone's feelings and an apology that was offered because the person giving it had genuinely understood something. This was the second kind. He let a moment pass before he spoke. Appreciated, he said. She blinked. She had expected more. He could see that some kind of expansion, some acknowledgement that required more words. That is all. You came over here and said it in front of the same room that heard the original comment. He said, you did not look for a private moment. You did not send a message through an attendant. You came over here yourself and said it plainly. He looked at her steadily. That took something. I am not going to make it harder than it needs to be. She was quiet for a moment. He could see her adjusting to this, recalibrating. She had prepared for a harder conversation. You are not what I expected, she said. People say that. What do they expect? He considered. Something larger, usually something louder. He said this without any particular feeling about it, just as a fact. Thessaly looked at him for a long moment. The caravan campaign, she said. Quietly, she said it carefully, like a thing she was not sure she had the right to bring up. I studied it, the outline of it. My military instructor used it as a teaching example. She never mentioned names. Most accounts don't. Call said 100,000 people went through that corridor, give or take, with 30 soldiers and a station with a lot of structural weaknesses we found useful, he said, and 18 of those 30 did not come home. I usually say that part when people bring up the numbers, because the numbers only mean something if you include all of them. She absorbed this. You do not like accepting credit. I like accurate credit, he said. There is a difference. She almost smiled. It was not a full smile, not yet, but something moved in her expression that was close to it. Commander Soys told me you do not give interviews. Not much to say that the record does not already say that. Seems like an underestimation. Cole said nothing to this. He glanced briefly across the room. The automatic sweep then came back to her. Can I ask you something? She said. It was not quite a question the way she said it. More of a notice that a question was coming. You can ask. She looked at him with a kind of directness that was different from the directness she had shown yesterday. Yesterday it had been the directness of someone who didn't think the other person's reaction mattered. This was the directness of someone who was genuinely trying to see clearly. You are clearly an intelligent person, she said. You could have moved into a different role years ago. Training position, a command position, away from active deployment, something safer. She paused. Why do you keep going? Cole looked out at the room again. The 14 delegations, the silver walls, the carved history, the soft light, the careful noise of people building something that might last or might not. He looked at it all for a moment. Because someone has to, he said. And I am good at it. She turned it over. He could see her doing it, examining it from different angles, checking for the part he was leaving out. There was no part he was leaving out. It was the whole answer. That is the simplest thing anyone has ever said to me about something that complicated. She said finally, most complicated things have simple reasons underneath them, he said. The complicated part is usually just everything built on top. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, thank you, Sergeant Dawson. For what? For letting me say what I needed to say. She paused. And for not making me feel worse than I already did. He gave a single small nod. Good evening, Your Highness. She turned and walked back toward the center of the room, back to her attendants and her obligations and the long, careful work of being who she was. But something had shifted in the way she moved, a small thing, the kind of thing only someone who had been watching closely would notice. Across the room near the corridor entrance behind the eastern tapestry, Yeliso stood with her hands folded and watched the princess return to the dais. She did not look at Cole. She did not need to. She had seen everything she needed to see. The reception continued. The delegates talked and ate strange food and built the slow architecture of political relationship, and Cole Dawson stood near the wall and watched the room and did his job the way he always did. Catherine Delegate stopped staring at the human table sometime in the second hour. Cole noted this and moved on. The summit had 4 more days after that. Cole did not think of it as 4 more days. He thought of it as 4 more shifts, each one with its own rhythm, its own variables, its own small things to notice and remember. The work did not change because of what had happened at the reception. The exits were still the exits. The faces still needed watching. Patricia still needed someone standing near her while she did the complicated human work of making agreements with people who were not human. But the days had something in them that the first day had not. On the morning of the third day, Cole was standing near the observation corridor on the vessel's upper level, the place where the wall was all glass and the stars were directly visible. He went there in the early hours when he could, before the delegates were awake and the halls were full. It was quiet, and quiet was something he valued more than most people understood. He heard footsteps and turned. Facily, Veron was walking toward him alone, no attendants. She was wearing something simpler than her reception robes, a plain deep blue, her hair down, the silver thread not woven through it. She looked younger this way, more like a person and less like a title. She stopped a few feet away and looked out at the stars. I did not know anyone else came here in the mornings, she said. I found it on my first walk through, he said. I have been coming here since I was 9 years old. She looked at the glass. My father brought me the first time. He said it was the best place on the vessel to think. Cole said nothing. He looked at the stars too. Can I ask about Reach 7? She said. She had not looked at him. She was still watching the stars, as though the question was easier that way. The record I have is thin. It says there was a systems failure and a containment breach, and a human unit was involved. The outcome was good. The details are not there. The atmospheric processor on Reach 7 was the only thing keeping the settlement breathable. Someone had run a sabotage program through the control network. Slow acting. It had already damaged 3 of the 5 backup systems before anyone knew it was there. He paused. The 2 remaining backups were going to fail within about 6 hours. She turned to look at him now. 6 hours to fix an atmospheric processor, to fix the network issue, get 2 damaged backups online enough to hold and isolate the program before it finished what it started. He said it without drama, just the sequence of things. The settlement had 8,000 people. Most of them had nowhere to go in 6 hours. Did you fix it? My unit found the program. A system specialist on my team named Dale wrote counter in about 4 hours flat. He had never seen that particular code before. He wrote it anyway. He looked at the stars. Dale went home fine. 8,000 people Kept breathing, that is reach 7. Thessaly was quiet, you led with Dale. Because Dale did the hardest part, she looked at him for a long moment. My instructor taught me that great commanders take credit so that history has a name to attach to events, she said. It was a practical necessity, maybe Cole said. I have never found it necessary. Because you do not care about history's opinion of you, he thought about this. I care about the work being done right. History can form its own opinions, she turned back to the stars. They were both quiet for a while. It was not an uncomfortable quiet. It was the kind that happens between people who have found someone unexpectedly that they do not need to fill every moment with words. I said something else, she said. Finally, her voice lower, in the hall. That first day, I said you look like someone who digs roads. You did that. Was not about your hands, she said. Slowly, I have been thinking about it. That was about wanting you to be less than you appeared to be. I looked at you standing there, and something about the way you stood made me uncomfortable, and I responded to that discomfort by trying to reduce you. She paused. That is not a good thing to understand about oneself. Cole looked at her. Most people never understand it at all. She did not seem comforted by this. She had not meant it as a question looking for comfort. And he respected that she had not tried to take the easier version of what he had offered. On the 4th day, she asked him about Port Vellum. He told her the short version: 16 hours in a port control tower, a standoff between a syndicate faction and the local authority that had been 48 hours from going catastrophic, a negotiation that had been handled by someone else, while Cole's team quietly removed 3 weapons caches from the building without anyone above noticing. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she said, you made the diplomacy possible by removing the thing that made it impossible. That is usually the job, he said. Your job broadly, yes. She thought about this. You make space for other people to do their work. It was an observation, not a question, and it landed in a way she had not quite intended it to. He could tell by the slight change in her expression when she heard herself say it. She had meant it practically as a description of tactics, but she had heard something larger in it as she said it. He did not comment on this. He let her have it. On the last day, the delegations began the process of packing and preparing for departure. The summit had produced 4 preliminary agreements and 1 full treaty and several relationships that would be described in diplomatic reports as warmer than projected. Patricia was pleased. She told Cole this while he was checking their transport manifest, and he said, that was good. And she laughed because that was the most he ever said about diplomatic outcomes, and she had stopped expecting more years ago. He was carrying equipment cases toward the docking corridor when Thessaly found him. She had her attendants with her. This time, 2 of them standing at a respectful distance. She had made an event of this slightly, which meant she had thought about it beforehand. Sergeant Dawson, she said. He set the case down. Your Highness. She looked at him with the clear amber eyes that had learned over 4 days to look at him differently than they had on the first morning. I want to say something before you leave. All right. When I came to find you at the reception, she said, I had prepared for a harder conversation. I had thought about what I would say, and I had thought about what you might say back, and I had prepared for a version of this that was more difficult For me, she paused. You made it easy. You did not have to do that. You could have made me work harder for it. I deserve to work harder for it. Cole picked up the case again. You came and said it plainly in front of the same room. He said that was already the hard part. The rest was just talking. She was quiet for a moment. You are very difficult to feel guilty around, she said. You keep turning it into something smaller than it is. It was already the right size, he said. You made a mistake and you fixed it. That is the whole story. Thessaly looked at him. Something moved at her expression. Not quite a smile and not quite not one. Something more complicated than either. If the Earth Confederacy sends a delegation to Valhari Prime next cycle, she said carefully, I would consider it appropriate if you were included in the security detail. He nodded once. I will pass that along to the ambassador. Please do. She paused. Safe travel. Sergeant, you as well, Your Highness. She turned and walked back down the corridor with her attendants, back toward the silver halls and the carved history and the long, careful work of being who she was. Cole picked up the second equipment case and continued toward the docking wing. Behind him, the vessel's lights ran along the corridor in their slow cycle, the same way they had run every day of the summit, patient and indifferent to what happened beneath them. 3 weeks later, Yellowis read the official diplomatic report on the Sarathis summit in her office. It was thorough and professional and said everything it needed to say. At the end of the section on outcomes in the part marked additional notes, someone had written that relations between the Valhari Empire and the Earth Confederacy had concluded the summit in a notably improved state, warmer than pre-summit projections had anticipated. No reason was given. Yella set the report down on her desk. She looked out her narrow window at the stars. Then she allowed herself a small private smile, the kind she kept for moments when things went better than they had any right to. Some things did not need a reason written down. Some things were just true, quietly, in the way that the most durable things tend to be. She picked up the next report and got back to